The first quarter century of the NFL was a rough and tumble way of playing football. Men played the entire game, all 60 minutes. Chris Willis of NFL Films joins us about his new book about these men that played full games in the single platoon system. Chris is up in just a moment to tell us all about it.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of pigskindispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal deposit of football history. And welcome to another edition where we get to talk to an author about a great book on pro football history. And this is going back all the way to the beginning of the NFL and, talking about some of these great early players. We have Chris Willis of NFL Films joining us, who's been on more than a few times talking about some of his books. He's putting out a book quite a bit, and we're really enjoying him. Chris, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
It's awesome to be here, Darren. Especially be able to talk about these early players. So thanks for having me.
Yeah, certainly. Now, the title of Chris's latest book is The NFL's 60-Minute Men, All-Time Greats of the Two-Way Player Era, 1920 to 1945. Now, Chris, that's a big topic, and these are some guys that maybe our modern ears aren't used to hearing their names. Maybe we've heard one or two of them because there's some big names in there, but there's a lot of guys in there that most folks have not heard. What was your inspiration for writing a book like this?
That's a good question. Yeah. I think the first sort of momentum was in 2019 when the NFL celebrated its 100th season. They had the all-time team, which I was a part of the voting, and then I did some rankings for Pro Football Journal, John Turney's site, and so I had some feeling of who some of the best players were, the greatest players. But I felt all the time that they don't get as much recognition as some of the sort of modern players. I mean, even if you're a casual fan, you might know who Joe Namath is, Jim Brown, let alone the Peyton Mannings and the Tom Brady's. Like, there is a certain generation that you still might know, and then really the early years it might be just Jim Thorpe and Red Grange, and that's it. Like, well, no. There's 25 years of history, especially the first, 2.5 decades of great play by, many more players than just a handful of names that some people know. So I think when you combine, that a couple years ago, with trying to promote and trying to get these players' names maybe out there a little bit more, that was the inspiration of putting the book together.
Yeah, and it's a great timeline that you choose, ending at 1945, which, we've talked about with other guests, and I believe we've even talked with you about it before, because it's sort of that World War II era sort of broke that the single platoon system, because there was a lot more talent out there. There was, they're having some trouble having some guys having players during the war and everything. So it changed into what we know today of having specialists, offense, defense, special teams, and but single platoon. That's why the title, I assume, is the 60-Minute Men.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's like the first 25 years in the NFL. From 20 to 45. And that was a real key point for me. Was I wanted to evaluate these players who all the players played both ways. They played 60 minutes, so some of the first questions I get when I say, oh, this is the book title, and they think, oh, so Chuck Bednarik. Well, Chuck Bednarik, although it's a great feat, was the last to go 60 minutes, but he did not play against players, consistently going 60 minutes, so some of those players that were sort of near the war years or at the end of the World War II, I just cut it off there just to say, okay, I know all these players all went 60 minutes. They played offense, defense, special teams. And so that's where that sort of 25-year era, to me, is the two-way era in the NFL.
Yeah. Now, the sort of the layout of the book, I mean, you have it really interesting. You talk about, you rank the players, and you have a top 45 where you go into some great detail on, tell some stories. You have a lot of excerpts of players that were contemporary that played against and with some of these guys that really had some great insight to them. So you can't get much better than that. And then you have a list that takes it up to 100 after that, like the 46 through 100. So why don't you maybe tell us how you determined the ranking and who to put on the list?
Yeah. So the first goal, like I said, it came out was, well, what year am I starting with? What year am I ending with? So we found that 1920, 1945. So I was the first. And then it was, roughly eight, I think it was like 8 or 9, sort of criterias that I would look into. And they all played a part. None of them was weighed higher than any other. So it was, all-time teams, and was a big thing, where I was trying to find as many all-time teams from players and coaches and executives and sports from that era, so because then that tells me who they thought was the best. And you take that in consideration, like, did the coach him, or did the player play? A lot of guys are going to pick their teammates and buddies, but when you start seeing names of opponents, that gave you a little bit more sense of who people might have thought was great. So you had oral histories, you had win and loss records, you had championships, other honors, whether it's all pro teams, whether they were on a Ring of Honor or Teams Hall of Fame. So all those criteria were meshed into one evaluation, so, and I sort of went through that and to say, okay, who has the best resumes, and then I started ranking them that way, so it wasn't just like, oh, you had to be in the Hall of Fame. No, I believe I have almost a dozen players that aren't in the Hall of Fame in that 45. And then some of them, like if I say, oh, who's number 100? Well, Jim Thorpe is number 100. And some people might say, well, you're crazy, Chris. Well, Thorpe's best years were before the NFL was founded. In 1920 was really his only productive year. You could maybe say 21 a little bit, but his Oorang Indians years, and the one game with the New York Giants, and he was not an elite player at that time. Now, if it was 1915, yes, and leading up. But so people might be surprised. Wow, Jim Thorpe's 100, and who's in the top 50? So, but that was like the fun part of it, is just, okay, let's evaluate everybody. Like I said, if I could have written 100 full bios, but then it would have been like 600-700 pages. I don't know. Besides us, who would maybe want to read a 700-page book about 100 of two-way players. But McFarland was great, the publisher, and be able to do 45 full bios, and to be able to talk. And I wanted it to be more not like a Wikipedia page. That's why I wanted to write a little bit fuller bios, because I just didn't want to be like, well, I can get that off of Wikipedia or Pro Football Reference. No, I wanted it to be a little more detail. And oral histories and testimonials was a huge part of it. That was one of my first goals, was to try to find players talking about other players. I can write what I think makes, Red Grange great, or Mel Hine or Don Hudson, but I wanted to hear it from other players, coaches, executives, owners, sports writers who, okay, this is what made, Dutch Clark great. This is what made, Patty Driscoll great. And it came from them, and instead of me just reverberating maybe what I think or what's in Wikipedia or Pro Football Reference, because I think that could be misleading stats. Some of the scoring, like you have to dig deep in it, and say, okay. I think one perfect example was 1929 with Ernie Nevers, and Ernie Nevers is great. He's up there, pretty high, and but his 29 year included the game where he scored 6 touchdowns. He scored 40 points, and you're like, oh wow, the guy scored 12 touchdowns. Well, the majority of those touchdowns came against the 3 worst teams in the NFL. The 6 against the Bears. Then there was like 3 against Dayton, 3 against Brooklyn. So like nine of his 12 came against like some of the worst teams, where the better teams sort of shut him out. So you got to take it, like I said, you got to, dig a little deep to maybe find, okay, what actually happened. Where now we can watch it, we go online, you got tons of stats, and all the time, and you can know that, okay, this guy has had a great year, so that did make the fun part of it.
Yeah. I mean, I loved some of the comments that you said on the players, the contemporaries that were playing against them. Some of the best ones were the linemen against linemen, and just some, hey, this was the toughest son of a gun I had to go up against in my years of football, and just just some of the comments like that, using some of the chat of the day, because I assume these are probably like some of these interviews are probably like in the 50s and 60s when these guys were, out of football, but still seasoned and still talking and reminiscing. So I thought that was great. But I love the consistency of your format on those first 45. And maybe you could explain to the listeners and viewers about that, what they can enjoy when they get a copy of the book.
Yeah, like I mentioned, you're following your criteria, so you want to touch on all that. And I mentioned before, like oral histories and testimonials were a big key of finding, and like I said, as much as they're great players, sometimes I found, some player who played for like 2 years, 3 years, which was the norm, average playing was 3 years, who did talk about, some of these other guys, or some of the great guys, so even if they only played 3 years, well, they might have played, 4 games against, some of these great players, and they can give you a testimonial. Yeah, he was that good and stuff. So, and footage is another thing, like I try to find as much game footage and game film, and because that's like you said, the linemen, it was a running game, it was a lineman game, so you wanted to see a little bit more of some of those guys that are just popping up on all pro teams, or you just assume is in the Hall of Fame, like, and a perfect example is, I mean, his name's been bounced around, is Ox Emerson. Like there's a little bit of footage of him. You watch him. Well, he was really good, and that's why he made all those all pros. And you look at him and he's like, well, why isn't he in the Hall of Fame? Because he's got all the check marks on his resume, whether it's, played for a championship team, they finished high in rushing for 4 or 5 straight years, they had Dutch Clark and Glenn Presnell and all these backs that made all pro. Well, somebody had to block for him, so he gets lost a little bit. But when you look at these things and you look at especially the lineman versus lineman, like, well, there's a reason why, Bronco Nagurski had him on his all-time team. Red Grange had him on. It was like, well, he must be a little better than that. If Red and Bronco are saying, if I had to field a team, I'm going to take Ox Emerson as one of my guards. So, so that's part of, the explanation, the chapters and like I said, the bios being fleshed. And then, there's some good stories, some of them have been heard but some of them haven't been. So I tried to find, some stuff that also made it, enjoyable to read, and like, okay, well, that's a great story of the 20s and 30s and playing 60 minutes, so because that's the title of the book. So I wanted to get that impression of these guys playing both ways. Some of them said, oh, I love playing offense better than defense. Some of them just said, oh, I just love to hit. So stuff like that. So it was enjoyable to try to find that type of research.
Yeah, the consistency of each of those first 45, you sort of have the reader, me as a reader, you sort of have me dip my toes in the water a little bit, have those basic bios, the name, rank, and serial number, where they played, went to college, things like that, basic bios that you would see on some of the reference pages like you talked about. But then you take us down and we get into the text, and the story and the testimonials about that player and everything. So I thought it was well done and consistent, and it was great too. It was sort of, there were stories to it, but it's a reference book in some ways too. Or you could throw on your coffee table and somebody comes to visit you and you have 10 minutes to kill, and they can, knock out one of these legends and read it, or, a dentist office or something like that. It's great for that too, or to sit down and have a long read. So I think that's incredible when you have a book like that you can go both ways like that. So well done on that. Now, okay, you led to a little bit. You had, about a dozen non-Hall of Famers on that list, which I thought was fantastic because there's, it's very well publicized that, folks want to see some more seniors getting into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. And maybe this is some avenues, by folks like you telling about some of these guys and letting us know about these legends. So maybe if you could talk maybe about a couple of these guys that are not in the Hall of Fame. I know you've already mentioned one or two.
Yeah, I mean, and I didn't plan it that way. Like I said, once you start reading and once you start doing the research, you're like, okay, because there were some impressions like, okay, I like him, but is he going to make the list? And then I'm like, oh, you know what? Maybe he makes not only does he make the list, he's up pretty high. So Ox Emerson is one of those. I think the one that I really enjoy when I do the research is Vern Llewellyn, the
Mhm.
Packers halfback. Who was pretty much the go-to guy for the Packers teams that won 3 straight championships, 29, 30, and 31. I mean, here's a guy that the team won 3 straight. Only Lombardi's Packers have won 3 straight NFL championships, and he's not in the Hall of Fame. I mean, I went back and I did some retro MVPs that are in the front of the book, which is my research as you go through, and I picked who would be in the top 5 MVP. And Llewellyn would have won back to back in 29 and 30. And so to me, he's like a no brainer. I've always liked his resume, and like I said, and he's very high on this list. I won't reveal where he's at, but he is very high, and he's ahead of a lot of Hall of Famers that are already, like I said, have been elected, and he's not. And St. Emerson's, up there pretty good, and then you get to some guys that you hopefully, like I said, we talked about linemen's earlier, like Joe Kopcha of the Bears, another guard, George Christensen, the Lions. There's another Lions lineman during that time when they won a championship and a tackle, and so those guys are tougher to evaluate because you don't have as much footage. And like I said, some of the testimonials, aren't. I mean, there's nobody living that can really push, some candidacy, and so. But it was very interesting, like I said, and then like you mentioned before, I have 46 through 100, and there's Hall of Famers on there. I list them and I make sure, hey, these are Hall of Fame, and so you can take a look and say, okay, the guys that are ranked in the top 45, maybe they need to be looked at a little bit harder, or like I said, investigate a little bit more, based on because I find it hard to believe that the NFL, or at least the Pro Football Hall of Fame and the selection committee, like they're done with anybody who played almost like since 1950. Like
Mhm.
so everybody that was great that is now in the Hall of Fame, who played the first 40 years of the league, like that would be a surprise to say that they're all in there. Let's move on to the more modern era, so hopefully, like I said, these chapters can bring some of these players to light, and get them that maybe proper attention.
Yeah. Well, before I ask it, my next question, why don't we give the opportunity here to tell folks again the name of the book and where they can get a copy of it at?
Yeah, it's 60-Minute Men, and it was published by McFarland just this past March. And you can pick it up on Amazon, or Barnes and Noble's website. You can also go to McFarland and Company. They do some football, but they do a lot of baseball. If you're a sports fan or historian, you might know of McFarland because they do a lot of unique titles. So, so 60-Minute Men in the era of the two-way play era from 1920 to 1945.
All right, great. Now, folks, I highly recommend it too. It's a great read. Now, well, Chris, when you were doing the research, okay, I'm sure, as a writer, I know that sometimes we have some preconceptions. We're going to write a story, but then you get into the research and the story sort of takes you a different course maybe than you really thought it was going to go. And I'm sure probably with some of these players, you had some surprises. Who is somebody that pleasantly surprised you that was maybe somebody you knew a little bit about, but you didn't realize how good they were till you got into the research?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned Llewellyn. He's one that over the years, like as I do more research, I've been impressed with, how good he was and how great he was. So, I think maybe the other guy that comes to mind is a couple of quarterbacks that might get overlooked a little bit because the way they perform is a little different function than now. Is Red Dunn, the old played for the Cardinals and the Packers, and Ed Danowski, the old Giants quarterback. So I think once I started digging a little bit more, I was more impressed of what they did, and especially their leadership. Dunn was a pretty efficient passer in Lambeau's system in those early years. He did a little better than I thought. And then Danowski, I think, was underrated. I think Danowski, when I looked at, especially in the passing game, was highly efficient. Led the league, I believe, a couple times in passing percentage, and was a member of Giants championship teams, especially the sneaker game. Played very well in that game in the upset against the Bears. So those are two names I think, besides Llewellyn, I think that sort of jump out a little bit more and were a little more impressive than I thought.
Yeah, that Danowski, I'm glad you mentioned him because he's probably one that really jumped out for me that, I knew of him, but, and I'm saying, good boy, that's interesting as Danowski, where you have him. And I started reading, I'm like, well, you know what? You make a pretty good case for him, and he's maybe a lot better than what I realized he was. So I've learned a lot about him. So I appreciate you having him in there. So, okay, sort of maybe on the flip side, who is somebody maybe you had going in some high expectations, saying, oh, this guy's going to be, way up on the list, and maybe, not because of his play, but because some of the plays, some of these other fellas that, advanced beyond him on the list. Who's maybe some of those players?
Yeah, I think, there was a couple of guys where I'm thinking, oh, maybe, George House is one. I think people automatic, but he wore like 10 different hats. So besides being a player, he did actually play, and he was solid. I wouldn't say he was spectacular. And obviously he's in the Hall of Fame for, the variety of things he did for the league, and his impact, so sometimes you see him and you think, oh, I mentioned Thorpe being at 100, but House, you think, oh, should he have been higher or lower? Then the other couple guys, that sort of came in that mid 30 that I thought would be, a little bit higher. Joe Guyon, because he played predominantly his career in the 20s, so he's in the Hall of Fame. He was in like the third or fourth class, but maybe not quite as dominant, as some of the ones in the top, 45, so there's a couple players like that. I think the other one who I'm not is Joe Stoudemire. He, when you look at him, like, Hallis praised him a lot, but that was one of his guys. He did have some All-Pro teams, but maybe not. Just like I said, that's just in my opinion. But there were some examples like that where, you thought you might have him higher, but didn't quite make it.
Yeah, I think, and I don't disagree with you on it. After reading what you had about these players ahead of them, I thought, like, George Wildcat Wilson, somebody that famous, maybe more famous because his college play and playing out in the original AFL and the Wildcats and everything, but some of the other backs being ahead of him, but I don't disagree with you after I read it. And I'm thinking, okay, he's probably right. It's just maybe the name makes me think higher of him because of, it's been pounded into you for years. But maybe some of those other guys too are the same way that you mentioned. So so great job. And I can't argue with the rankings, and it's fun because they're debatable, and we're not going to debate with you on it, but it's one of those things that makes it interesting. That's what makes good reading, and people buy the book too. So that's always a good thing too. So we'll save that for people in forums and comments and stuff like that. They can do that.
Sure. And that's part of it. Like I knew, like, like if people discuss it, that's fine. That means they're reading the book and they're putting some energy in it. And, if they want to say, hey, why is this guy, high on his list and not high, so that's fine. That gives a good discussion, and, that's always productive.
Yeah. Now, did you go back and look at like any ratio of like, was there like more quarterbacks than another player? I mean, I didn't really go and do the tally, but I just sitting there thinking about it. Was there like one position that was more predominant that made the list of 45?
I mean, I don't think there was one that's for dominant. I mean, I think it played out the way it did with the importance of the positions. Like there wasn't quite as many centers, obviously, because there's only one on a team, and they start, where you have two guards too. So I think if you look at the breakdown, I think they're kind of consistent with what the positions were or the importance of each position. So obviously the guys who touch the ball are going to are going to somewhat be, but I didn't want to just go off that, so that's why there is a decent amount of guards and tackles on the team. So I always thought that it was a good breakdown. I just didn't overload it and like, oh wait, I only got like two guards and three tackles. Like, no, it didn't come to that. I think, if I did, my proper research, I thought it came out that way. You look at it and you're like, okay, there's some guards and some tack, because they were just as prominent as the backs, even though the backs probably got more of the headlines. I mean, the Cal Hubbards and the Turk Edwards and them of the world, the Mike Michalski, they're up there, and they're up there pretty high. And you're like, okay, because that's why, there's a lot of people that are saying how great they were, so that's, I thought it came out, but there wasn't one like, oh, it was going to be a bunch of quarterbacks, and that wasn't going to be the case.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I got the feeling of it, reading it. If I was going to put it, these guys played both ways, so they played offense and defense. But if you're going to put it in a modern term of, the rooms, I think there was probably just as many interior linemen as there were ends, as there were, backs, as there were quarterbacks. So I think you broke it very well and evenly and distributed them around. It wasn't, the top 10 weren't quarterbacks and then halfbacks. I loved how the placement of these guys, and probably fairly so. And even some teammates, going on. And I loved how you sort of interconnected some of those. You had, when you had like Fats Henry and Link Lyman, and they're, not no pun intended, but they're sort of linked together, and being those bookends for the Canton teams. And they play together over in Pottsville too. I can't remember if they did or not, but I know FASTA. But just some interesting things that you did like that connected the stories, even though they were separate stories. So that was enjoyable too.
Yeah, I mean, as many teams that came in and out of the league, especially in the 20s, a lot of the greatness were on certain, obviously, teams and franchises. The Bears, Packers, Giants have a lot of, but then you'd have like we mentioned Ernie Nevers. Well, he played for Duluth and then the Cardinal. Some guys might have only played for I know Ken Strong played for a lot of years for Staten Island before he went to the Giants. So yes, the main teams that survived and the teams that won championship obviously are well representative. And there's a lot of links, like you mentioned, a lot of links between those teams, and guys like Cal Hubbard who played for the Giants and the Packers, and he won championship with both. So he's going to play with really good players too. So and they're represented in the list too.
Yeah, most definitely. Now, I guess, Chris, you have any last things to say? Maybe to share with the listeners to encourage them to buy the book, and then we'll let you tell you where the book you can get the book again.
Sure. Yeah. No. I mean, I think if you love early pro football, this is a book that you'll be interested in. Like I said, the chapters flow pretty easy. You can like you mentioned, kind of can stop, put it down if you want to. Read just one chapter a night, and you can do it pretty easy, and each chapter kind of sits by itself, so to speak. And then the other thing for me is, I mean, the internet and social media is huge on who they think deserves to be in the Hall of Fame, and a lot of it is modern guys, and there's nothing wrong with that, but I would hate for this era of players, and even talking into the 50s and even early 60s, I hate for some of these players to get lost just because, nobody's around to talk about them, or they're not living, or there's just something coming, you can't watch footage on YouTube or whatever. Like, you know what? These players are still great. They can't be, it shouldn't be ignored. So I think between some of that, the book has, can give a reader, a very, fun read as well as educational, and just like, what, this is a good source. Cause like I said, it's not just reading a Wikipedia page or just reading a stat page, puts it in a lot of context of the era, what players thought who was great, how they became great. I mean, I love some of the Don Hutson, stuff about, how he made himself just a great receiver, whether, in practice, he would catch 1,000, when I read that, or when I did the research and read the Hutson, it just almost looks like it's a Jerry Rice story, like, that he did in the 80s and 90s. Well, that's, Hudson did it in the 30s and early, or 40s, like the way he practiced, the way he played, the way he wore, shoulder pads that weren't all that, to give him more speed and things like that. Like, he was a legit athlete
and played some solid defense too.
and then eventually played some solid when he, found the right position. So, if you go on the McFarland website, publishers, the book will be there, and then you can also get it on Amazon and Barnes and Nobles.
Yeah, folks, I highly recommend it. And if you want to know who that top spot is, best way to do is get that book and enjoy it, and enjoy just like I did. And Chris probably did it during his research, and people read it. So Chris, we really appreciate you coming on. Appreciate you preserving football history and writing that book. And thank you for your time to tell us about it.
Thanks for having me again, Darren. It's always a pleasure to talk early football history. So thanks for having me.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.